A 17-year-old boy texts his girlfriend, "A cop just stopped me," then vanishes. 2 months later, his body is found, stripped, shot execution style, and left in a creek. Who killed Blake Chappell? And why did the police have no leads? Blake Chappell was a 17-year-old teenager from Georgia, seemingly just another high school student trying to navigate life. He was friendly, outgoing, and had a tendency to make friends easily. He had simple pleasures: skateboarding, rap music, and even running a small side hustle selling energy drinks to his friends. But beneath this normal teenage exterior, Blake's life was marked by turbulence that would eventually lead to his tragic fate. In May 2011, Blake became involved in a heated confrontation with the stepfather of his then-girlfriend. The girlfriend had run away from home to be with Blake, and when her stepfather found out, the situation escalated into violence. Blake was physically attacked by the man, and soon after, an arrest warrant was issued against him for custodial interference. The charges stemmed from the fact that Blake had helped the girl evade custody arrangements. While Blake was trying to do what he thought was right by returning her home, the situation turned hostile, leading to Blake spending 16 days in jail. This series of events led Blake and his mother to make a drastic decision to leave their hometown of Jonesboro, Georgia, and move to the town of Newnan. It was a move intended to escape the past and find a fresh start. The new town was quiet and far removed from the trouble in Jonesboro, but Blake's life would never truly escape the shadows of his previous actions. By the fall of 2011, Blake had already moved on from the past. He began a new relationship with a girl named Ryan Campbell. The two attended the homecoming dance on the evening of October 15th, 2011. Blake was excited about the event and spent the evening with Ryan and their friends. However, this night would be the last time Blake would ever see the people he loved. After the dance, Blake went to Ryan's house, and they spent some time together. Eventually, he made the decision to leave and head back to his friend Austin's house, where he had stayed earlier in the evening. Before leaving, Blake called his mother to let her know how great the night had gone. He mentioned that he would see her the next day, but this was the last time he would ever communicate with anyone. Around 5 a.m. on October 16, 2011, Blake made his final journey to Ryan's house. He walked for approximately 90 minutes, navigating through the streets in the dead of night. This decision, in hindsight, seems inexplicable. Blake could have easily gone back to Austin's house and continued the night there, but instead, he chose to return to Ryan. Was it an impulsive decision, or was there something more to it? At 4:30 a.m., Blake sneaked into Ryan's room through the window, and they spent about 30 minutes together. However, the moment was abruptly interrupted when Ryan's grandmother discovered Blake in her granddaughter's room. Blake, in a panic, climbed out the same window and began his walk back to Austin's house. As he walked, he texted Ryan and her mother, apologizing for the situation. His final text messages were filled with regret and sorrow, giving the impression that Blake was truly sorry for the inconvenience. However, at 5:30 a.m., his communication ceased, and nothing more was heard from him. The last thing Blake sent was a message to Ryan saying that he had been stopped by a police officer. According to his text, the officer had asked to see his ID and inquired about his whereabouts. But no police report could confirm this interaction, and Blake's claim remained unverified. This detail, though seemingly minor at the time, is crucial. It paints a picture of Blake being in a vulnerable situation, alone in the early hours of the morning, stopped by someone in authority, whether real or not. And then, after this message, Blake disappeared without a trace. As time passed, the search for Blake intensified, with his family and friends, along with the police, combing through the area for over 2 months. The investigation yielded no concrete leads, and Blake's family was left to wonder if the person who had stopped Blake that morning was a real officer, or if the encounter had been staged by someone with far more sinister intentions. Blake's body would not be found until December 19, 2011, when a passerby discovered his remains in a creek near the Summer Grove Golf and Tennis Club. The body was face down, wearing only an undershirt and underwear, with no personal items found nearby. The cause of death was determined to be a gunshot wound to the head, inflicted at close range. The case was filled with contradictions and unanswered questions. The messages Blake sent just before his disappearance pointed to an interaction with a police officer, but there was no documentation to support this. Did Blake lie about the encounter to impress Ryan, or was there something more nefarious at play? The absence of any concrete evidence left investigators grasping at straws, while Blake's family was left to grieve without closure. As the investigation continued, the possibility of Blake having been targeted by someone he knew began to take shape. The violent nature of the murder, coupled with the lack of any clear motive, suggested that this was not a random act. Someone had to have been watching Blake, perhaps even anticipating his every move. This level of planning and calculation was a hallmark of a killer who had thought about the crime long before it happened. But who and why? As the search for answers stretched on, the haunting questions lingered. Who stopped Blake that morning? Was the encounter staged? And what could have possibly motivated someone to kill him in such a brutal manner? With no answers in sight, the case of Blake Chappell remained a chilling reminder of how easily a young life could be taken, and how elusive justice can be when the truth is buried beneath layers of lies and deception. Before we continue, make sure to like and subscribe. It really helps us a lot. Thank you. As the days passed, after Blake Chappell's body was discovered, the mystery deepened. Investigators struggled to make sense of the clues, each seemingly offering more questions than answers. The absence of any personal belongings around Blake's body was one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. It was as if someone had gone to great lengths to erase any trace of Blake's identity or his journey that night. No phone, no wallet, no bag, just a young man left in the middle of nowhere, his life snuffed out in an instant. It was as if the killer had not only taken Blake's life, but had also robbed him of his humanity. The way Blake's body was found, stripped down to just an undershirt and underwear, suggested something far more sinister than a random act of violence. It was almost as if the killer had deliberately dehumanized Blake, forcing him to meet his end without any of the usual personal markers that might have helped identify him. This chilling aspect of the crime pointed to someone who knew Blake, or at least someone who had been watching him closely enough to know the precise moment when he would be vulnerable. The fact that Blake had texted Ryan and her mother so frequently in the hours leading up to his disappearance added another layer of complexity to the case. His messages were filled with remorse and concern, suggesting a young man who had no idea that he was about to be killed. Blake's last text to Ryan, mentioning that he had been stopped by a police officer, seemed to hold some significance. Was this an attempt by Blake to rationalize or make sense of an encounter that seemed out of the ordinary? Or was it the work of a more sinister force? Was the police officer Blake mentioned a real figure? Or was it simply a fabrication born from a moment of fear or confusion? The lack of any corroborating evidence for the police officer's interaction only deepened the mystery. If the officer had indeed been real, why had no record of this interaction been found? It raised the possibility that the officer was not a legitimate law enforcement figure, but rather someone impersonating an authority figure to lure Blake into a false sense of security. This made the situation even more unnerving, as it suggested that the killer had the foresight to manipulate Blake into a vulnerable state, perhaps offering a sense of safety when in fact there was none. The more investigators delved into Blake's final hours, the more they realized how meticulously planned the crime might have been. Blake's body was discovered over 2 months after his disappearance, indicating that the killer had either kept him hidden or had disposed of his body far from the original crime scene. The fact that Blake had been walking alone in the early hours of the morning without a clear destination made it all too easy for someone to take advantage of his isolation. It was a prime opportunity for anyone with a malicious intent to target him. But the key question remained: who would have wanted to kill Blake? What was the motive behind this brutal murder? The fact that Blake was seemingly well-liked and had no obvious enemies made the case even more perplexing. There were no indications that Blake had been involved in any illicit activities or dangerous associations. He was simply a young man caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, or so it seemed. But in the world of true crime, nothing is ever as simple as it appears on the surface. The most troubling part of the investigation was the lack of any reliable leads. Several theories about the murder were proposed, but none could be substantiated. Some suggested that Blake may have been the victim of a random act of violence, but the level of detail and planning involved in his death made that seem unlikely. Others speculated that someone in Blake's past might have targeted him, but the lack of a clear motive or history of conflict left this theory unconvincing. The idea that Blake's death could have been the result of a personal vendetta remained one of the most compelling possibilities, though it was unclear who might have had such a motive. As weeks turned into months, and no new leads emerged, the case began to grow colder. The hope of solving Blake Chappell's murder started to fade, leaving his family and friends in a state of uncertainty and grief. It was a feeling that many families of murder victims know all too well, the sense of helplessness that comes with not knowing who took their loved one and why. For Blake's family, every unanswered question was a wound that wouldn't heal, a piece of closure that they would never get. As investigators continued to review the evidence, a critical question remained unanswered. Why had the killer gone to such lengths to make sure that Blake's death was not just a random killing, but a carefully orchestrated crime? Was it personal, or was Blake simply an unfortunate victim of circumstance? And why had the killer left no trace of himself behind? These questions haunted the case, driving the investigation into murky waters with no clear path forward. The eerie silence surrounding the case only deepened its mystery. Blake's murder was no longer just an unsolved crime. It had become an enigma, one that seemed to mock the efforts of those trying to bring justice to the family. The lack of solid evidence and the absence of any clear suspect left a feeling of uncertainty that pervaded every aspect of the investigation. It was as if the killer had disappeared into thin air, leaving only the chilling memory of Blake's last moments, and a family left to mourn in the shadows of a crime that might never be solved. The case of Blake Chappell remains open, but as the years pass, the chances of finding answers grow slimmer. It's a stark reminder of how elusive justice can be when the truth is hidden behind layers of deception and silence. Blake's family continues to hold on to the hope that one day someone will come forward with the information that could finally bring them peace. Until then, the mystery of Blake's death will linger, a haunting reminder of the dark side of human nature and the evil that can lurk in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. As the investigation into Blake Chappell's death continued, the case grew increasingly complex, with more questions than answers. The absence of solid evidence left many to wonder if Blake had become a victim of something far darker than a random act of violence. Investigators were left to grapple with a series of chilling questions. Who would go to such lengths to cover their tracks, ensuring that nothing tied them to the murder? Why was Blake, seemingly an innocent teenager with no known enemies, targeted in such a brutal fashion? The fact that Blake's body was discovered so far from where he was last seen raised additional suspicions. Had he been moved to that location after his death, or had the killer staged the scene to confuse investigators? It was a methodical and calculated act, one that left no clear indications of a struggle or fight, as if Blake had been incapacitated or coerced into the situation. His body was placed in a creek, face down, in what could be interpreted as a final insult, an act that seemed to suggest that Blake's life was of little value to the killer. The unsettling details of his death, his body stripped of clothing, the absence of any personal items, pointed to a crime that was personal. It was as if the killer wanted to erase Blake's identity, to strip him of everything that made him who he was. This dehumanizing act made it clear that this was not simply a crime of opportunity, but one that had been planned with chilling precision. The killer had gone to great lengths to make sure that Blake's identity would be difficult to determine, and to cover up any evidence that could link them to the crime. But even with all these disturbing details, the key question remained: who would want to kill Blake, and why? Theories began to emerge, each one more perplexing than the last. Some speculated that the killer was someone from Blake's past, someone who harbored a deep resentment or anger toward him. Others suggested that Blake's death could have been the result of a twisted form of revenge or jealousy, perhaps from someone who was envious of his life or his relationships. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that no theory could be fully confirmed. The killer's actions were too deliberate, too well thought out. This was no spur-of-the-moment crime. It was a murder that had been carefully planned, down to the smallest detail. The lack of any clear motive left the case shrouded in mystery, and the lack of reliable leads made it seem as though the killer had vanished without a trace. With each passing day, the hope of finding the person responsible for Blake's death grew dimmer. His family, especially his mother, remained in a constant state of anguish, knowing that the person who took her son's life was still out there, walking free. The sense of helplessness that came with not knowing who had committed this act, and why, weighed heavily on those who loved Blake. His murder was no longer just a tragic event. It had become a haunting enigma, one that would linger in the minds of those who sought justice for him. The questions surrounding Blake's death are not just about solving a crime. They are about understanding the depths of human malice. Who would commit such a cold, calculated act? What kind of person would take the life of a teenager with so much potential? A teenager who had done nothing to deserve such a fate. The silence surrounding the case only made the questions more intense, and as the years went by, the desire for closure grew stronger. Blake's family has fought for years to find answers, to bring the killer to justice, but the case remains cold. Each new piece of information, each new lead only seemed to push them further from the truth. The only thing that remained was the lingering question: who killed Blake Chappell? And why? Without an answer, the mystery of his death continues to haunt not only his family but also the entire community, a chilling reminder that sometimes justice can be a long and elusive road.